Welcome to this session on assessment in higher education. I will be conducting this assessment session in 3 parts, and the learning outcomes are, at the end of this session, you should be able to describe the key components of systematic, standardized, and objective way of running assessment in higher education, design assessment for student learning, and also you should be able to design assessment where you align the assessment task with the intended learning outcome. And the last part of this session, I will be conducting a session on how to design rubrics, which is nothing but an objective marking guide. So the important question we have to ask is, what is the role of assessment in higher education? Does it really matter? The answer is yes, it does matter. It matters for the students because the grades or the marks which is awarded at the end of the course or the semester determines their future studies as well as employment. Not just for the student, it also matters for the teachers because the way assessment is conducted and based on the outcome of the assessment, it gives us information on how the course has gone, whether we have been able to achieve what the learning outcomes were, and what type of intervention is required for the next term around, and how could we make it more robust. So, as a teacher, we all know that one of the biggest incentive for student learning is assessment. Just to give you an example, if I was going to conduct a class and it was an important topic, but I informed the students that this particular topic will not be assessed at the end of the semester, there is a very good chance students would not pay attention. For them, at that stage, assessment really matters, and it's one of the biggest incentives for the learning. Moving forward, broadly, I would like to classify the different types of assessment in higher education, and I would like to restrict the terminology to these two as formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment is well described as assessment for learning. This assessment happens when the course is still happening and the students are still learning the content. Hence, it's very important for us to design formative assessment in such a way that it provides systematic, timely feedback, rather detailed feedback to students, which should enhance their learning. Compared to formative assessment, summative assessment is one which happens at the end of the prescribed period, which is either the semester or the end of the program or at the end of the course. And usually these ones, or rather all the summative assessment, comes with the marks or a grade or a score attached to it. These are usually high weightage and high stake assessment and always happens at the end of the semester or the end of the course or the program. In this particular session, I will go more into detail on formative assessment, but before I get into formative assessment, let's look into what are the different aspects we need to ensure to design a good, robust assessment in higher education. So looking into the key aspects of assessment, what you see here is, and this holds true both for formative assessment as well as for summative assessment. Our assessment needs to be valid, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be transparent, and I will go into each of these points briefly. It needs to be diverse. All of these assessment needs to have a robust feedback mechanism. It should motivate students' learning. And at the end of the day, it should be efficient and manageable given the fact that we are dealing with cohort of students anywhere from 50 to 100 in a class. So let's look into it. What does a valid assessment mean? Valid assessment means whatever you want to assess, are you assessing or are you using the assessment instrument which is valid in that particular context? So just to give you an example, if you want to test students on their problem-solving ability, but then you're assessing them on a written piece where you're looking at their spelling, grammar, cohesive writing, then it's not a valid assessment. And I'm not saying you should not be assessing on those aspects. If you really want to assess, the key point here is students should be made aware that they are not going to be just assessed on their problem-solving skills, but also on these particular aspects because it's a written piece of assignment. Another way to give you an example of what a valid assessment is, when you are trying to test students' knowledge on one particular topic, you end up designing a question which is either on an unrelated topic, or the way you phrase the question is not clear to student what the question really wants to ask, then once again, your assessment is not valid. Hence, it's very important, be it a formative assessment or a summative assessment, our assessment needs to be valid for whatever we are trying to test in our course or the content. Now, the next good thing is the assessment needs to be reliable. What does reliable assessment mean? Reliable assessment means that if I am marking my student on particular assignment piece as, suppose 80%, now if that same assessment is marked by another examiner or another teacher, the marking should be close to what I have marked. And if it is not, then my assessment instrument as well as my marking instrument is not reliable. And we want this to be as objective as possible and not make it an mark students' assessment based on subjectivity. And that's what we refer to as reliable assessment. The next thing is, which is very important, is our assessment needs to be transparent. When I say assessment needs to be transparent, doesn't mean we need to give the question paper to the students in advance, but students really need to know what are they going to be assessed on, which really means that when you're delivering the content or the course, the intended learning outcomes needs to be well defined and shared with students in advance. So students exactly know what is expected out of them on what criteria and what learning outcomes they are going to be assessed either during the course or at the end of the course. Hence, we really don't want any surprises for students. Our aim here is to make the students well aware of what is expected out of them, give them enough time to come well prepared, because preparation helps, they perform well, and then assess them. And that's what we mean. The process needs to be transparent. We don't want these surprise tests and trying to test where we are trying to test how much they don't know, but we want to test what they really know. The next thing is diverse. We are all quite aware of the fact that our classrooms are now covered, or rather filled with diverse types of learners. Hence, when you're designing a course, try to incorporate different types of assessment tasks where you're not testing student always on a written piece or an oral presentation, but try to get a good mix. Give a lot of group activities, ask them to do some designs or make some models, some field work, research projects, and try to incorporate different aspects so different learners can benefit out of it. And that's what we refer as diversify the way you are assessing your course. The other point is, which is more important, I will talk more about it later in the session, is how to make or design robust feedback mechanism. What this really means, and especially holds true for a formative assessment, is formative assessment is designed to help students learning. And if it is designed to help student learning, we need to give them detailed feedback on what has been going well, what has not been going well, and also provide them mechanisms of how they can improve further to improve their learning. And that's what I am referring here as robust feedback mechanism, where we can provide timely, consistent feedback to all students and a detailed feedback. And this becomes very important because we don't have any more like 5 or 10 students sitting in our classrooms, but we have 50 to 100 students sitting in our class. Hence, all of these aspects needs to be considered before you start the course, and assessment is just no more just designing questions, but considering all of these aspects where you can have a good mechanism to provide detailed feedback. Next thing is, when we design these questions, as I said, it should be in alignment with the intended learning outcome, and our questions or assessment should motivate student learning. We should aim in such a way that it motivates deep learning, not just superficial learning, and that's totally up to us based on how we design these assessments. Last but not the least, as I mentioned earlier, our way of conducting these assessments needs to be efficient and manageable. Efficient in a way, it needs to be in a timely manner, because if you have conducted an assessment 1 month into the course, but if your students don't get feedback for the next 2 months or so, it's going to be pointless, because these assessments are designed to improve learning, and if that feedback has not been given in a timely manner, that's not going to benefit students. So to make it more efficient, the best way in our current scenario is to embrace technology. Embrace technology where you can provide common feedback to all students in a much more timely manner, and then address individual student based on what the individual requirements are. So moving forward from here, let's get a little bit more into detail about formative assessment. As I said, formative assessment happens during the semester, and it happens when the learning is being formed, and it really gives us a lot of opportunity where we can really improve or enhance student learning. It also provides students opportunity where they are ready to take more risk. And the important thing which I want to highlight is start these formative assessment very early in the course. You don't have to wait for the first internal exam, which happens after a month or 2 months. You can start it straight away from your second class or your third class. As the term suggests, formative assessment is when the learning is being formed. You would notice that many times formative assessment would come without any marks or scores, but many times it also comes along with the marks or score. And if it does come with a marks or score attached to it, ensure that overall the weightage of these formative assessment to the final exam is not more than 20 or 30%. The reason behind it, we don't want to penalize students when the learning is still being formed. We want them to be comfortable to take risk and be able to solve more challenging questions which help them for deeper learning. As you would notice, I would talk more about how do we incorporate detailed feedback mechanism. And this is one of the key aspects of designing a formative assessment, is how am I going to give feedback to all my students in a uniform way and a systematic way, and more importantly, in a timely manner. Just to give you an example, if you are marking a written project or a written assignment, you start marking the first 10 when you're fresh in the morning. You would notice that your feedback or your written feedback to each and every student is in much more detail. If you're doing the same marking at the end of the day when you're tired, what ends up happening is we end up giving just the scores, and as feedback or the written comments starts becoming less and less. And that's not fair for our students. We really want it to be consistent across all students. And at the end of this, or the last part of this session, I'll be talking about how to design rubrics and how these rubrics can make it more systematic and uniform feedback across the entire cohort. And the other thing I would like to mention here, that we often give our feedback and comments on what the students have not done right, what approach is, whether the approach is incorrect or if there was an alternative approach. The important thing also is to give them a feed-forward message or comments, which would help them to understand what can they do to improve this next time around. And that's what I am referring here. Give them a detailed feedback as well as a feed forward to individual students. Now, when it comes to what is formative assessment, a lot of people consider those internal exams or the internal quizzes which happens during the semester as the formative assessment. But formative assessment is not just restricted to 2 or 3 internal exams. pretty much every single class, when you're observing or performing your in-class activities, you are looking at the non-verbal feedback. So when we are teaching, there are a lot of students who are interacting with us, nodding their head. These are all part of formative assessment, because as a teacher, it's giving us feedback whether the class is engaged or not, how many students are paying attention, and all of these questions which we pose to the students during our sessions is all a part of formative assessment. Homework exercise, a very good one, because that helps students to think what has been conducted in the class, look at extra resources, and then give the assignment. The important point here is when students submit their homework exercises or assignment, we need to provide a detailed feedback, because it's the feedback which is going to help them in their learning. And that's something we really need to work on. You can ask students to write reflective journals, where reflective journals could be about how the sessions have been going, what are the challenges, how have they been performing. These are very good, especially when it comes to lab works. And these reflective journals allow students or give them opportunity to slowly start getting the skill of metacognition, where they are acknowledging what do I know, what do I not know, and what do I need to ensure that I address the points which I don't understand. As I mentioned, here is the question and answer session which you conduct, be it formal or informal in your class. All this is a part of your formative assessment. Other important thing about formative assessment is collecting student feedback. When you collect student feedback on every session, on every lab which you have conducted, or a field visit which you have organized, it's about student writing what did they understand from that particular task, what did they not understand, and when you address those, it really helps students to improve their learning. Hence, it's a very important aspect of formative assessment. And as you would notice here, all the points which I have covered as an example of formative assessment, none of these, or usually none of these, comes with any marks or grades attached to it. Because it doesn't come with marks or grade attached to it, you don't have to always have grades or marks attached to it. But keep in mind, all these types of assessment or learning verification is designed to improve student learning, and that's the key point here. Now, when it comes to in-class activities, there are a few things you could really incorporate. When you finish a topic or a module, before moving ahead to the next topic or the module, what you could do is conduct a short multiple choice questions on the key aspects or the key learning outcome from the previous module. For this, you don't have to have, a typical paper and pen exam where you're sending the question paper. One good way of conducting is this: you can have 3 or 5 multiple choice question on your PowerPoint presentation. Ask students to work individually, just give them 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and then discuss each of these questions, not just what is the correct answer, but detail on why the other options were incorrect. This really helps students to clarify their doubt, because now they have just covered a single module, and it helps them to consolidate what has been taught in the previous module before moving forward to the next concepts. Now, we normally ask, or we tend to summarize what was covered in the previous lecture or the session. I would encourage you to ask students to do this for you and tell them very explicitly that you will be picking up random students in every class to come and summarize what was done in the previous class. This really helps students or motivates students to come well prepared, and when they summarize, we get a good feedback on what were the concepts which was really clear to them and what are the concepts which needs to be readdressed. Other important thing I would encourage all of you to use is minute card. Minute card is nothing where you, at the end of the session, you ask all your students and participants to give you a feedback on what did they understand, one topic, one point in that session, and what did they not understand or which was not clear to them. As a teacher, you would imagine that if you have a class of 50 or 100, and if you have to go through each of these minute cards, it will take a long time. But that's not the truth. I have done this many, many times, and I can assure you that it will hardly take you 5 or 10 minutes going through these cards. And what you would notice is, usually in a cohort of 60 or 100 students, there will be 2 or 3 common points. And if you go through these 2 or 3 common points, which has been not so clear to students in your class, and you address this before you start the next session, students really see this, that you are taking responsibility of the learning, you are addressing those carefully, and that really helps us to build that rapport with students. And that's very important for us as a teacher. The last one is, as I mentioned earlier, with the assignment task or the group activity, try to incorporate reflective journals or reflection and ask students to write what did they learn, were the challenges, how could they improve the next time. This is something where student will not appreciate maybe if you do it just 1 or 2 times, but if this becomes a common practice for all the courses in their 4-year or a 3-year duration, and you would notice that slowly they start building up this awareness of how to address the issues on which they have some doubt, or they were not able to do it well in the exam. And that's something which is more a long-term thing which we want to incorporate in our students, and it's definitely going to help them lifelong. The last one is peer assessment. And for peer assessment, I would ask you to incorporate this in all of the group activities which you conduct in your course. Be it active cooperative class which you are conducting, ask students to score or mark their other group members, because that's how they take responsibility of what the task has been given to the entire group, and that really helps them also to learn from each other. So the only thing I want to highlight here, when you're giving a marks or a score when it comes to peer assessment, once again ensure that the weightage is very low, because at the end of the day, we are going to evaluate students on their individual learning, and we do not want them to be penalized when they are being marked by other group members, because you don't want the weightage to be very high. So keep it as small as possible. But all at the same time, incorporate in different types of assignments or group activity, because students do benefit a lot from peer-to-peer learning. Now, usually I get these questions on how can we give detailed feedback? How do we improve their learning? One example I shared at the start, if you are running in multiple choice questions, ensure in the class that you don't just give them a score like 9 on 10 or 8 on 10, because in that case, they only know how much they have scored. To really improve their learning, we need to go through each of the options and let them know why the other options were incorrect. That really helps them to clarify their doubt and consolidate their learning. If you do have short questions type of assessment, where each question is like 200, 300 words, or it has got a lot of different approaches when it comes to problem solving, ensure that you have set criterias, marking criterias for each of these questions. And the key point here is you need to share those criteria with each of these students at least 2 weeks in advance, so they know what really they are going to be assessed on and how much they should prepare and what's the weightage of these criteria. I'm going to talk more about these setting criteria when I talk about rubrics. For now, the important point here is for all these short questions or group presentation, we need to set criteria and share those criteria with students 2 to 3 weeks in advance, where they are clearly aware of what is expected out of them. This holds true for your written assignments, or also for your research projects, or anything which is not an objective assessment task. We need to set criteria and make this process transparent for students. So this brings me to the end of my first part of this session. The next part, we will be talking about how to align our assessment tasks with learning outcomes And in part 3, we'll be talking about how to design rubrics. Thank you very much.